Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the South Orange Public Library Lecture Series, Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, the moderator for the series, and today I am so excited to have Professor Ron Watson with me today. He is one of my oldest and dearest friends. He's a fellow William and Mary alumni. He's a fellow Japan traveler and student of Japanese language, although he's a lot more fluent than I am. Former roommate in Japan.
That's
right. And now he's a professor at Beloit College in Wisconsin, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. I just wanted to say, Ron is one of those people who has the charisma of a cult leader. Luckily, as some of your students, I'm sure know, but luckily he has such a good heart. He's such a good person that he uses his powers for the betterment of humankind. So we're going to hear about some of the fantastic and important work that he's doing, not only in Beloit, but in the larger, national community. And I'm very excited to hear about it. But first, I will tell you a bit more about Ron. He is an associate professor of political science and health and society at Beloit College. He earned his doctorate in political science from the University of New Mexico in 2013. In addition to lifelong interest in Japanese language, society, and culture, Ron's research interests include the politics of race and ethnicity, constitutional reform, domestic and global health inequalities, national healthcare system, and public health policy. Ron is a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement in Beloit, and he serves as a commissioner on the Beloit Police and Fire Commission. So as you can see, Ron is totally invested in a lot of important community issues and organizations, all of which resonate in our own community and communities around the country. So I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Please help me in welcoming Ron Watson to the program. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I have literally never been compared to a cult leader before, but it's exactly what I would expect from Laura. And thank you. I will continue to use my powers for good, because I can't be bothered to lead a cult.
But you could. But
I could. Make no mistake, I could. But what I'd like to talk to you all today about is a talk, and in fact, just before everyone joined, I was telling Laura that I'm actually prepared to talk about a couple of things, but I think the first one and the main topic is going to take most of the time, and this is the discussion of radical common sense, these sort of social policies that I think could be ultimately transformational for social change in the United States. So what I will do is I will share my screen, and we will go from there. And as time permits, we will probably go into a question session. And I do want to encourage people to ask questions, because that's how I learn, and I think that's how many of us learn best. And when we get to the questions, you can feel free to ask about anything. Laura has told you I have an extensive background in Japan, which has very much influenced and shaped how I think about government and what is possible, as well as Japanese language just being cool. So at any rate, I'm just going to dive right in. So as part of my discussion today, I'm going to begin with what I call radical common sense number one, which is fun diversion. So what is fun diversion? Well, fun diversion is really another way of talking about this thing that some of you probably heard about, this idea of defund the police. And so the sort of rationale there, the reason why I avoid it is that I think defund conjures up in the minds of many people this notion of abolishing the police. And I actually had an experience with a friend of mine locally who called me up, an older gentleman. He called me up when a lot of the protests were happening and people were saying this, and he was sort of distraught. He was like, what are people talking about? Defund the police, Ron, what is this about? And I was like, well, first calm down and let's talk about what they're largely saying. Now, don't get me wrong, abolition may be right for some departments. But what I suggest in what I'm going to suggest today, in effect falls well short of that. And so for me, in my mind at least, defund the police ends up being sort of counterproductive, especially if it conjures these very dire images in people's minds, not least of which because fund diversion is actually very sensible. And so what I would argue here then is that for most folks, what this would mean is diverting funds from more traditional policing and the way that that's come to be understood in favor of approaches, programs, and efforts that prevent crime and potentially problematic behavior from the start. And we can sort of think through what that might mean, diverting funds to programs that say address poverty, for example, or address other sorts of behavioral issues that begin as children. In practice, of course, some departments across the country have already hired on social workers instead of additional officers to either ride along with officers or to actually go out and on calls, right, on certain types of calls on their own. Some of you may be familiar with the organization Cahoots out in Eugene, Oregon, which became the sort of poster child for how this could work. And Cahoots stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. But also, a similar program that was inspired by Cahoots is happening in Denver called the STAR program. That's a support team assisted response. And this, of course, involves sending unarmed volunteers who are sent to usually, in both cases, about 20% of calls, particularly those involving intoxication or some sort of mental health or other related issues. Again, we talk about why is this common sense, but I'll get to that in just a second. So what I would argue here is that this ends up being a sort of common sense, radical common sense, because funds should, especially when we're talking about government, they should actually go to where they're most effective. If it turns out, if you're looking at your department and many or most of the calls that you're getting are mental health related, why would you not utilize those who are best trained for such work? And along the same lines, if your current approaches clearly aren't working, right? If so, you see someone walking down the street having some sort of episode and approaching them in a way that then either triggers further action or results in, heaven forbid, in their injury or death. If that clearly isn't working, then what I would argue then is for government or governance to be considered good governance, then the onus must be on government to find approaches that do, in fact, work effectively. One of the best examples that I would bring up here involves actually Chicago. A couple of years back, actually about 4 years ago, some students and I had the opportunity to look out over a variety of different cities to see what was the financial cost of these sort of police-involved violence and brutality and other sorts of issues, including that included sort of police misbehavior. And what we found that in the city of Chicago alone, over about an 11-year period, their police department cost the public over $500 million. Yes, I said billion, not million, not thousands, $500 million over that period due to wrongdoing by officers, and effectively with little to nothing to show for it, right? And so I invite everyone to think, what could have been done with those funds instead, including affordable housing, mental health and job and education-related services and efforts, or even something like universal basic income. In other words, these are efforts that ultimately would have led to the enhancement. And I'm going to just switch slides here for just a second. Sorry, go back to this one. Give me just a second. But it would have ultimately led to the enhancement versus the undermining of public trust. Police, at the end of the day, are agents of the state or locality in which they are authorized. And so when we think about what bad police behavior really does, especially when it goes unpunished, what it really does is it suggests to members of the public that government is actually okay with what happened to you, or the either actual or perceived abuse. So that's part of what I think around this. And so what's the transformational element there? Well, the transformational element for me is that beyond the possibility of new institutional configurations that might see, for example, a police department and a public health department merge into something like a Department of Public Health and Safety, or presumably the removal of military hardware and the warrior versus combatant mentality from domestic policing. I would probably argue that the most transformational aspect of this could be response rules that minimize loss of and maximize protection of life, as well as an end to the casual violation of people's civil rights through no-knock or one-knock warrants, programs like stop and frisk, as well as the provision, of course, of needed assistance to people in crisis. And I think at this point in time, especially if you pay attention to the news, too many of us have seen these wellness checks, right? Someone calls and says, oh, I haven't spoken to Yolanda in a few days. And the last time I spoke to her, she seemed like she has some issues. Can you go and check on her? And having those end in tragedy when the police show up because this person is having an episode. I think we've all seen more than enough of those, especially over the past few years. And then so it'll be transformational in that way as well. And these will, of course, these transformational changes will also save money by avoiding jail, incarceration, and of course, lawsuits, like we see in the case of a place like Chicago. Mm-hmm. All right, so now let's go to radical common sense number 2. And this is the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'll start by just talking about, well, what is Black Lives Matter? I think at this point, probably most people know, but I'll just say that it's, and this is a truncated definition. It's an anti-racist movement launched in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin and subsequent acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman. And of course, it has gone well beyond that at this point, right? I said the resonance of the movement grew with subsequent protests following the murder, of course, of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York, and many other unarmed Black men and women nationwide. And that's my alarm for class.
Time for class.
Time for class. Not today, Satan. At any rate, we'll move on from there. But anyway, this has grown following the murder of these individuals. And I will also add to James Crawford III as part of this unarmed Black men who, and women, of course, like Rekia Boyd as well, who are killed effectively for no reason, typically at the hands of police. At any rate, so this movement also has inspired the movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of more than 50 groups seeking social change to improve the lives and treatment of Black people in the US and internationally. Now, here's what Black Lives Matter isn't. It is not a declaration of the importance of Black lives only, or a dismissal of the value of non-Black lives, as many would have us believe. But what it is a demand that the lives of Black people be valued and respected to the same degree as their non-Black and specifically their white counterparts. So what's the sort of common sense then around that, the sort of radical common sense? Well, here's the thing. As it turns out, movements in general are a form of social learning. At their best, all social movements expose areas of injustice or social blindness and discontent. So in that sense, I would argue that BLM, right? So I'll just call Black Lives Matter BLM. BLM is in the same vein as the anti-war in Vietnam movement and various civil rights movements over US history, including, of course, women's suffrage. Through BLM, many Americans, as I think many of us have come to recognize, have been shocked to learn of this disproportionate impact of police violence on Black and brown people in the United States. But also, thanks to these protests, they've learned about the structural forms of racism that Black Lives Matter and other organizations have always protested. And this newfound knowledge then among those who are typically not directly or disproportionately affected by excessive use of force by police, for example, has in turn, I would suggest, has paved the way for at least some preliminary attempts at policy change. And I think one of the best examples of an attempt to do that, even if it hasn't come through, was the idea that the city of Minneapolis should have been working to dismantle its police department and create something else. I mean, the idea that we would even see that come to a vote, I couldn't even have imagined it 5 years ago, right? And then there's another piece. So as I put on my sort of political scientist hat, BLM is in many respects the rational response to a lack of government responsiveness. And so when we think about it in that way, it's important to understand that in American democracy, any number of scholars will tell us that individuals and groups are supposed to make common cause to affect or change policy, including through, and again, it's important to underscore this, First Amendment protected demonstrations and protests. Again, this is how governments learn. This is how societies learn. It's one of the many ways. So what are the transformational elements there? Well, I think what I would argue is that the transformational elements include that going beyond sort of forcing improvements in government responsiveness. But most notably, we can see that in notable change in approaches to policing. And of course, more attention to the persistence of structural racism and discrimination, as well as the need for greater equity and inclusivity in American society. The idea that we could then not only talk about government being more responsive, but the ways in which government needs to be more responsive. This is the transformational piece if we sort of realize and recognize BLM and similar movements as really sort of teaching our society something. But I would say that also BLM and this sort of continued protest, they bring about the possibility, at least, of long overdue policies for healing and progress in American society. They sort of force us to consider what I'm going to talk about next, and that's namely reparations for the lingering impacts of slavery and Jim Crow. So we'll go here. So what are reparations? And I just want to confirm, everyone can still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so what are reparations? Well, reparations, and this is according to the US State Department. And so the US State Department effectively defines reparations as a key element of providing justice to victims of serious human rights abuses or atrocities, and that reparations programs then are meant to focus on acknowledging the needs of victims for redress and seek to address the consequences as well as the causes of violations in material and symbolic ways. And so I would then argue that reparations really are not about trying to fix the past or to make up for the past. That's already happened, right? As the name implies, reparations seek to repair in the present the legacy effects of past discrimination. And for me, that's sort of an important distinction. Things that have happened, right? But the lingering effects is really what it is that we're trying to address. Now, when we talk about reparations, reparations are typically thought about, at least until fairly recently in time, had been thought about in the international system, and they have a long history there. Probably some of the best known examples include cash payments or in-kind payments from West Germany to Israel and other entities following the Holocaust. But of course, there's this infamous case in which Haiti, after sort of tossing off slavery, was forced for a very long time to pay reparations to France for its independence. Wow. And there are any number of researchers who point to that period of reparations where, basically a rich country was forcing a poor country to pay it for, loss of property and these sorts of things. Many people indicate that that's part of what has hampered Haiti's development, its socioeconomic development for well over a century. Domestically, though, the only clear example of both in which we have sort of symbolic and monetary reparations came in the 1980s. And that was the payment to Japanese American survivors of a racist policy of forfeiture of property and forced internment during the 1940s, so-called Executive Order 9066, that was signed by, of course, FDR. Those survivors, if you're wondering what happened there, right? The survivors each received $20,000 and an official apology signed by then President Ronald Reagan. But I think it's important to point out here, and interesting to point out, that only survivors received anything here, which I think really speaks to this deep-seated notion in the United States and in American culture that only those people who were impacted were directly impacted should receive anything. Even their children were not eligible, from my understanding, to receive the $20,000 payment. But at any rate, despite how perhaps problematic that has been, in the case of Black Americans, attempts to pass legislation in Congress to create a committee simply to study the impact of slavery and Jim Crow, okay? Now, so slavery is one thing, but then also Jim Crow is a whole other thing, right? I mean, my mom went to a segregated high school, so it's not that far in the past, right? Have never been passed despite decades of effort and congressional control by both major parties. I really like to emphasize this because I think when I have this conversation, folks go, oh, those darn conservatives. Well, yeah, I mean, sure. But, you know, whether or not you consider yourself to be a Republican or a Democrat, that we have not, and be more liberal or less liberal, no matter who was in charge, this has never passed. Not both houses of Congress. And of course, no reparations for American Indians either, although, you know, there's some argument to be made. It's a slightly different case, but I would still say that reparations are not only more than due, but more than appropriate for that group as well. So what's the common sense here? Well, here we are. The common sense, the radical common sense, as it were, is that reparations are really just a collective version of what decent people teach their children, right? To apologize and to make amends when you've done something wrong. I almost, it's one of those things that seems so silly to me, right? You know, who wants to hang out with all these people who cause damage and then are like, well, you know, that was yesterday, man, I'm good today, right? Who does that? I mean, I guess people do that, but you know, you generally don't hang out with those people. I would also make the argument, I hope you don't hang out with those people. If you're hanging out with those people, you should not hang out with those people. Monetary reparations then for survivors of Jim Crow segregation, and this is based on my own calculations, would cost about the same as the most recent stimulus packages. And of course, significantly less than the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Which according to some estimates is about $8 trillion, a good chunk of which was not actually on the books. My estimation, you could arrive at something very, very robust and dramatic with about 2 trillion, and it could go up to 4. But this idea, if we were able to do this reparations package, arguably, I would say it would have similar effects to what we saw with the most recent stimulus packages, which were about $2 trillion, right? And that's that they would boost domestic consumption, thereby boosting the economy, which everyone would benefit from, right? Most of the money would be spent in the US. But of course, this stands in stark contrast to what we see many ultra wealthy people do when they get tax breaks. And there have been, of course, any number of incidents over the last 5 to 10 years, where we have found that these folks are actually squirreling their money away out of the United States in order to hold on to it. So that's part of what I would argue is happening there. But symbolic reparations, even if you think that monetary reparations it's too expensive, it's not really a thing. I would actually say that symbolic reparations cost little by comparison, but are actually deeply meaningful. And there are probably many folks who would argue that these would be the most difficult to do, funny enough, right? Despite the fact that they cost almost nothing. And just think about some examples here. How about changes in political representation, right? All we need is a little bit of, tweaking of the Constitution here and there, and you could end up with some form of proportional representation based on race and ethnicity. You could do that. It wouldn't really cost anything. The national anthem. How about we have a national anthem that doesn't include a third verse that basically talks about blowing up slaves? How about we change our flag from one that reflected reality back in whenever that was, right? Back in the 1700s, and that now reflects who we are today. Why don't we have federal recognition? And I think some of this has started to happen, right? We're starting to see federal recognition of Juneteenth, which of course doesn't really cost anything. Or the conversion, and this is one of my favorites, right? President's Day. Man, you remember what you were doing on President's Day 2022? Right, exactly. Of course you don't, right? Because President's Day means nothing to anyone. It's a bank holiday, right? But how about instead of that, how about we turn that into a day of atonement? A day where the leaders in office can actually talk about the ways in which the country is trying to do better and is sorry for what it did in the past. Or, and of course, we started to see this happen across the country now, the removal or replacement of statues and public art that either commemorate racist and problematic, other sorts of highly problematic attachments to a racist past, or to have that replaced with public art that then celebrates who it is that we are today. And so I also talk about something called restorative reparations. And these are reparations that are aimed directly at eliminating disparities in health, wealth, and well-being. But I really see those sorts of reparations as an investment, okay, that will in fact deliver society-wide returns going forward. And you can think of just a handful of examples here. The economic impact of tax credits, for example, or subsidies to support home ownership, business creation, therapy, because heaven knows I need therapy, and healthcare. So, some people laughed a little bit too hard at that one. Yeah, but yes, I definitely need some. But again, these restorative reparations are this way to make people whole, to make our society whole. And what's the transformational element there? Well, for me, I say that the transformational element is that we might finally actually see the groundwork laid for the equitable reallocation of financial, educational, and political resources. And again, you say, well, if you're focusing on reparations, how does that work? Well, in the United States, we have this strong relationship between race and class that I often sort of do this when I talk to students about it. I say race class, right? Of course, it's not a lockstep relationship, but it's a strong enough one that that there's some good, I think some good evidence that if we affect this one piece, this one area around sort of racially targeted reparations, that we might still see these benefits emerge nonetheless. We would, of course, then see massive reductions in poverty and its ills, including, of course, issues around violence and community-based violence. We would see perhaps the beginnings of national reconciliation and identity building. Imagine, right, a world in which we as American citizens are starting to build together not only sort of moving past this very, very terrible past. I mean, a past that's based, quite frankly, on not just one, but two major crimes against humanity, right? But to move past that and to actually build an identity together, not based on one dominant racial or ethnic group or in its position, right? But one in which there's a recognition of the need of us and the difference of us as Americans to sort of come together and really be different from the rest of the world, and to show it what it can mean to live in a truly diverse society that values that diversity. But beyond that, I would say there are these untold psychological and emotional benefits that would emerge from the idea of saying I'm sorry and meaning it. I mean, I think myself personally, I'm fairly well adjusted. Mentally and emotionally and psychologically. But there have been any number of moments, even over my life in recent years, where it's pretty clear that I would probably react. I think I'd probably cry if something like this happened. Like I have a pretty deep and emotional cry if we saw our society really move in this direction of apologizing for his past rather than doubling down on saying things like we hear from Mitch McConnell, right? No one should alive today should be paying for the sins of people in the past. Yeah, if only that were true, though, Uncle Mitch. It's not actually true. Lots of us are paying for the sins of the past, and even though those sins in many cases weren't even our own. So I will just conclude there by saying that that the recent nationwide turmoil and polarization that we see are, for me, as clear as indicator as any, that much work lies ahead in creating the kind of society that serves the interests and needs of all its people. And then the failure on both sides of the political aisle to take decisive action to acknowledge and redress the crimes against humanity that are slavery and the so-called Jim Crow era of legalized segregation and discrimination. This failure did not in turn, as it turns out, it didn't make things better. So fund diversion with respect to the police, the Black Lives Matter movement, and reparations to address the legacies of the crimes of slavery and legal segregation may seem on their face to some people as very radical solutions. But what I hope that I have shown just in our brief conversation here is that by and large, these concepts are nothing more than common sense approaches to confronting and moving forward from the painful and brutal legacy that the founders, and then of course, unfortunately, successive generations of those in power have unfairly left to us all. So with that, I'll sort of stop here. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I will ask if folks have any thoughts, questions. And Laura, if you want to ask me some probing questions around this or anything else, that's fine. If not, we'll talk about some other stuff.
Yeah, I can start things off anyway. And then if anyone else has questions, if you either want to just say it or you can write it in the chat and I'll read it if you're feeling shy,
I'm like a chat rat. Like I live in the chat, right? Like totally like a chat troll. So put stuff in the chat.
I'm backing up now to the first common sense, radical common sense number one. I was just wondering, like, is there openness to the idea of fund diversion on the police side of things? I mean, I imagine it depends where you are, but is there openness to that idea? I think it's an amazing idea. I was just wondering that, if you know.
No, it's a good question. So there have been, I think there's a knee-jerk reaction from many departments to say no immediately, right? But I think one of the examples that I identified was a place called, I think it's Alexandria, I want to say Alexandria, Kentucky. But that, it's a very, it's a small town, right? But that town, they found that they were there's my superpower.
Sorry, that was me.
That's okay. That's all right. But what they found was that they were spending a large amount of money on like arresting people who were intoxicated or who were having sort of other sorts of, mental and emotional health episodes. And of course they, on the more compassionate side, they found it wasn't really helping. And so they hired on a social worker. They hired her on as I think just to work part-time some of these cases. And what they found was in fairly short order, they ended up in about a year or two saving over, I think, estimated 40 grand in sort of, yeah, exactly, right? Now, if you're a small town police department, $40,000, well, even if you're not, I mean, $40,000, that's someone's salary, right? And so there have been examples there of some jurisdictions doing that. And we've seen, again, even in the case of Colorado with their STAR program, those folks ride along with some of the police. So I think some of them ride along and then some of them don't. Ride along with the police, and then they are able to engage people first, right? Because they have the skills to do so. But even here locally in Beloit, we saw over the past, I'd say probably over the past 5 to 6 years, we've seen our police department really push for officers to get sort of critical, what do we call it? critical intervention training, right? CIT, right? And so that went from one person doing it because they, wanted to not have to shoot people and in crisis, to now it's a part of the department. So I'd say there is some openness. I think it's about the framing of it more than anything else, right?
Right.
You say defund the police. It's like, well, wait a minute. We're out here trying to help people. You're talking about defund because, again, what does that trigger? Defund means I don't have a job. I can't take care of my family. Of course, people are going to react that way, right?
Yeah, fund diversion sounds exactly like what it is. Defund the police does not sound like what it actually is.
Right. I mean, for all practical intents and purposes,
Yeah. Does anyone want to jump in about that first common sense? Anybody have a question before I move on?
Okay, so Kathy jumped in and says, I know this is not Dr. Watson's topic and perhaps ashamed to be derailed by current events, but I'm curious if Dr. Watson can apply radical common sense to, what's the second part?
The Ukraine, is that what you were
to
going
to
say,
Ukraine?
Yeah.
I mean.
Wait, I wanted to say something. I got confused. Yes, I would love to hear what you have to say. I've got all this echo about the Ukraine.
Okay.
But prior to that, I wanted to jump in with fund reprioritization. About that might be another way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some version of that as well, right? And what it all boils down to, I don't disagree with that, right? I mean, because it's also fund reprioritization, I think is amply government speak enough to not sort of trigger anything from us, right? Reprioritization, what exactly is that? I'm not scared of it, but I don't want to pay more taxes.
I know what it means.
Right, I don't know what it means, so I'm okay. So I mean, I think that works too. Again, as long as the core principle remains the same, which is we want to put our sort of finite dollars where they are best suited to achieve the ends that we want, which is a reduction in crime, healthier communities, happier communities, and of course, safety for officers as well, right? I mean, we don't want people who sign up for this particular type of public service to have their lives sort of, unnecessarily endangered either. But at the end of the day, this is about the protection of the public. And so wherever we could allocate a community allocates its funds, it should go towards ensuring that we're making things better and certainly not making things worse. And I think that's one of my concerns when I think about military hardware and this awful idea that came out of the federal government under Bill Clinton. Surprise, surprise. So my students know I'm not a big Bill Clinton fan for a variety of different reasons. And we could talk about it if you want, but we probably shouldn't on this forum. But at any rate, but my point is that this idea that we're going to transfer unused military hardware to police departments, what a nightmare. It's only fueled a mentality, us against them mentality that is not only problematic just at the face of it, but it's actually dangerous.
It is, yeah. I was wondering, moving on to the reparations part, would it be possible for a president to accomplish some of those reparations via executive orders?
No, go ahead, finish out your thought.
No, I was just listening to you say, like, either party's in charge. They couldn't even, pass a committee. It doesn't surprise me. I was just wondering, like, would that be possible for a president to just do an executive order or two? And why has that not happened?
Well, maybe the easiest part is the answer is the why it hasn't
happened.
But we'll start with
rhetorical.
Is it so? Could it occur? Yes.
Yeah.
Some parts of it. Well, I mean, I think it depends if you're talking about monetary or symbolic reparations or or the reparative ones. But particularly, I think the president has a great deal of, at least theoretically, a great deal of authority over those who are in the executive branch, right? And so, in that sense, the president can do things like declare national holidays and national days of atonement, and of course, like the recognition of Juneteenth is like this big thing, right? And that just shows that it can happen. But The real question is, I mean, some of this will require budgetary allocations, right? Because we're not talking about a small amount of money.
Right.
I mean, even though I have made the argument that $2 to $4 trillion is doable. And of course, it's not just a one-way transfer, right? I mean, that's the other thing that people miss, right? They talk about things like, oh, well, giving people this money, they're just gonna take it and blow it. And
yeah.
So in fact, don't we want them to take it and blow it? Right? So you get the money, you blow it, you put it back into the economy, right?
The economy, right.
Right. I mean, there's a cynical way of seeing it that way, right? But of course, we would want people to invest it in long-term property and other sorts of things that could then generate more economic value. But the reasons why this doesn't happen, I think it's just for so many years, it's been a political non-starter, right? And many Americans consider it to be sort of political suicide to really talk about this. And it's really troubling to me, like the idea that no one has even thought to really do much of this until very recently. It really does trouble me because anyone can recognize, especially with Jim Crow, like let's leave slavery out of it. In fact, in my calculations, I don't even mess with slavery anymore, right? There's this problem of what do we call it? Is it primacy that comes into play when we deal with something that is so far removed, okay? But Jim Crow ain't far removed. So no matter how you slice it, like I was born in 1971, right? 4 years after Loving v. Virginia. 4 years. Wow. So it's not like 25 years later or 30 years later. Like, no, 4 years, right? Like I said, my mom went to a segregated school. And my mom is not an old woman yet. She's on her way, but she ain't old yet, right? So there are plenty of people who are alive today, and that includes some members of Congress. I mean, people like Mitch McConnell, right? Who were alive and well during this era of legalized segregation. So the idea that, oh, well, we don't have any responsibility for that because that happened so long ago, can't make that argument here, right? And so I guess, I'm sort of spinning around a little bit to say that ultimately, the reason why this doesn't happen is because of the extraordinary devaluation of the value and worth of Black people in America. I don't have any other explanation. I think all other explanations fall short. Financial explanation. Well, this is what I used to hear all the time. Well, if you do this, it would bankrupt the nation. Well, those stimulus checks didn't bankrupt nobody. I mean, we're still kicking. In fact, now we got inflation.
Yep.
So there you go, right? It didn't bankrupt folks because, as it turns out, modern economies and the modern American economy, especially, is extraordinarily dynamic, right? $1 trillion ain't what it used to be. I want to put it that way. I saw, Moon, you put something in the chat here. You said about BLM. How do you feel about the process in general? Do you see any improvement in terms of folks' behavior in general? Well, I guess it depends on who you're talking about. If you're talking about improvement in the behavior of police departments, I think that's still a mixed bag. I think that we saw an extraordinary amount of resistance from many officers who felt sort of personally slighted by the idea that that people would protest officers continually across the nation, continuing to do this sort of bad behavior. But yep, gotcha. On Ukraine, I'll get back to that as well. But yeah, I think that if you talk about sort of folks in general, I think it has generated a great deal of, among the ordinary members of the public, a great deal of awareness of these issues. So much so that I don't really see us as a nation going back to where, oh, I didn't know about this. Right? It's like, yeah, now everybody knows. And that knowledge. Now, here's the question with knowledge always: what do you do with that knowledge, right? It's one thing to know a thing. Now you have to do something about it, and that's where I think the action stage of the public in general is still not quite there. It's still not quite there. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that people, now that we have this greater awareness. I mean, I think about all the folks that I talked to over the past year or two, and especially after George Floyd's murder. And especially older white folks I talked to, they were like, I just did not imagine that it was like this kind of thing was happening. And of course, on the one hand, there's the cynical part of my brain that's just like, how the hell you not know this is happening? But fair enough. If you've got to care about it, it's got to affect you, right? In order for, I was actually talking to students this morning, right? This is one of the things that I think holds us back as a species, honestly, to be sort of grand, right? That holds us back as a species, is we sort of have a difficult time recognizing and truly accepting something that we didn't personally experience. And then conversely, we have a difficult time extrapolating more generally from our personal experiences, meaning we both think that a thing that happened to you, right? So if something happened to you, you then extrapolate that, well, that's just the way things happen to everyone. But you also forget, now on the flip side of that what happened to you might actually have been a rare event, right? So, you had a bad interaction with someone who looks like me, right? That doesn't mean that every person who looks like me is going to harm you or is going to have a bad interaction with you. But that's not how our psyche works, right? Especially when it's been sort of addled by sort of racist stereotypes and beliefs. This question about Ukraine, yeah, I mean, I think Ukraine is really, really difficult. But I also think that the Ukraine situation illustrates why we cannot presume that the worst case scenario won't occur. And the reason why I say that is about 2 weeks ago, I was listening to, well, I guess like 2.5 weeks ago, listening to NPR when this buildup first started happening. And people in Ukraine were like, oh, people outside of Ukraine don't understand. Russia just does this every now and again. And, we don't care. We're carrying on with our lives. And I remember thinking at the time, like, yeah, man, I don't know. That's a sort of really blithe way to think about this guy who has shown himself to be an authoritarian ruler, who has designs on your country. It's a really blithe way to take it. Oh, well, don't make too much of it. And then it happened. And so now, I sort of look at the situation, I go, there's really no good way out of this now. Lives have been lost now, right? Property has been destroyed, like legitimately destroyed. I know a lot of people fear that this could, result in a wider war, World War III. And of course, Putin didn't make things better by putting his nuclear forces on alert, like against Ukraine, really? Like, talk about overkill. I'm not even going to talk about what that might mean psychologically, but the reality is that I think Europe and the United States are in a tough space here. If you ask me what I would have done, what I would do in this situation, I would do it, to be frank, exactly what everyone is doing. I would lock down the sanctions first, right? And make them really sort of this ironclad gate. Like, nah, all of y'all who are connected to Russia and to this oligarchic structure, you're going to pay for it. But I don't know. It remains to be seen. It's still a sort of, fluid situation. But I think the first steps that the United States government and other governments across Europe are making, I think this is where you start.
It's been kind of amazing to see the countries like come together so quickly and like decisively. That's been like a positive thing to see in the midst of this horror. It's been kind of crazy.
Yeah. And yeah, I completely agree. And I think if nothing else, what the situation in Ukraine will teach us all, is that, one, the worst case scenario can happen, especially with respect to Russia. And again, we haven't even talked about why this is happening and why it is that Putin may feel threatened by NATO, right? But it also tells us that I think we have to be vigilant. That Ukraine is a democracy, and this is one of the first times in our lifetimes that we've seen a non-U.S. democracy with nuclear weapons. A non-U.S. democracy be sort of come under threat by a country that is a nuclear-powered authoritarian regime. And so this is, I think this is teaching us a lesson. Do we run to the defense of democracies? Should we? And if we don't, what are the repercussions of not doing so? So yeah, there's a lot of questions here. I wish I could be more sort of authoritative in what I have to say, but Yeah, I'm watching this just like everyone else.
Yeah.
Isabella, so Bella, you have a question in the chat. I'm going to jump into that real quick. So do you think there is a formulaic, reproducible way to counter that human impulse to only care about what you've experienced? Like, how can we force ourselves systematically and individually to expand our spheres and empathy? Well, I think one of the things you do is like Laura and I is actually become friends, live together, hang out, and do stupid stuff together. I think, that's one of the ways that you do it, right? Stepping outside of your comfort zone. I mean, we're both from the South, right? And there's a way in which we could have gone in different directions around that, but we didn't. We recognized our common humanity and our common love for things like the Indigo Girls and that kind of stuff. And next thing you know, X-Files, and this is back before we had streaming services, right? All we had was X-Files, right? For your weird stuff. But I think it's recognizing that that's part of it. Now, of course, the impulse is to say that this is where government should come in and force people to do A, B, C, and D. And I think that there are any number of examples, including from the countries in Eastern Europe and especially the Balkans, as we saw that fall apart, that just having a Leviathan can keep the peace, right? Some overarching force can keep the peace. But unless you have a really deep-seated program of encouraging inequality and interactions with folks, that is the moment that Leviathan goes away, all hell will break loose. So you really have to be very conscious to make real connections with people. And I hope that answers your question. Of course, if not, I'll talk to you more about it privately because Bella's one of my students. And then Zeke, you said on reparations, how do you deal with Congress and people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene? I mean, you don't deal with them. I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why reparations won't occur, why even the study of it won't occur. Because there is such strategic, even symbolic, right? Monetary or symbolic. In fact, I normally think about symbolic reparations, really, right? Because I've had so many people over the years say things to me like, well, like I said, it would bankrupt the country. Okay, fair enough. Then let's change the flag. Oh my God, no, right? Like, it's just a flag, right? I mean, it's a symbol, right? And symbols change over time. But it's extraordinary, right? It's any number of symbolic things you could do, right? How about this? How about make sure that our textbooks always tell the truth about this, right? Well, we see what happens when you try to do that.
Oh, critical race theory.
Right, critical race theory.
God,
my God. So, never mind the critical race theory. I didn't even know about critical race theory until like 8 years ago, right? I didn't even know about it. Like the idea that there are like fifth graders, somewhere who are like, this is what you have to understand is that the power structures and that ain't happening. No, but what CRT has become, of course, is a boogeyman, right? Mm-hmm. It's really become a stand-in and a not too clever euphemism for getting rid of talking at all about the racist past of the country. Mm-hmm. And we all know that not talking about problems makes them go away, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It is the best method.
Yeah. If you have an STI though, for real, if people are like, is this your first information? Don't think that not talking about it is gonna make it go away. You gotta go to the doctor. So I'm just gonna... All right. So
oh my gosh. Oh wow.
All right. Any other questions I can answer here?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we got to wrap up in a few minutes. And God, I have so many other questions I want to ask. I want to talk about Japan.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear about national divorce.
Yeah.
But you might have to come back on.
I'm happy to do so. We'll have to, if possible, we'll have to make sure it doesn't happen during class time again. But because my class got super lucky today.
This is educational for you.
It is educational, and actually, several of the students showed up, so I don't have any complaints.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I would love to have this conversation, have an additional conversation.
Yeah.
Will we be able to access the slides outside the call? Yeah. I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Is that one of your students or?
No, I don't know. Not yet. I don't know not yet. So I'm happy to.
Yeah. You could send them to me or something. I don't know, somehow.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to write to librarian@sopl.org and give us your info, then we can get you the slides.
Oh, no, as it turns out, it is one of my students. Sorry.
Okay.
Natalia,
It sounded like a student question.
Yeah. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. So yeah, just send me an email. I got you covered.
Well,
yeah.
Do you have any final? I was just going to do a wrap up, but do you have anything final to say? I was going to ask you, actually, have you ever imagined an alternative to our flag? Like, what would it look like today?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine it would be something that sort of, really recognizes the fact that we're a racial democracy for now. So for me, I imagine something with, a bunch of different hands coming together, and you could still maintain, the red, white, and blue, which we really love, right? But, with just the stars instead of 50 stars, and these are our 50 stars that we put our stink down on. Like, no, how about just symbolic stars around, right? Even 13 of them, if that's still important, but something that really speaks to the diversity of who we are today, right? As a nation. Remember, the country was founded at a time when people like me, and even people like Laura on the screen, were not really permitted to be, well, not really. I wouldn't have been permitted to be anything, and she was only permitted to be kind of half a person, right? And so, at least from a political standpoint.
Yep.
And so, at the end of the day, is that it's just a different world. So I would say that. I mean, I think as what I would end on is, one of the things we have to recognize is that, this is a society that has great promise, as we all know, but it is one that is also in need of great repair. And in that sense, rather than fear that repair and refuse to do it and continue to kick the can, as they say, right down to future generations. And this is what I'll say when we talk about the national divorce too, is that the most important thing that I think we can do is have the bravery to face our issues today. And that includes recognizing that, all of these things that we're learning through Black Lives Matter and talk about reparations and fund diversion, that these are all just common sense approaches to making our society better.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ron. That was wonderful. It was great to hear you talk about this, and it was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
And thank you all for coming. I just wanted to, and thank you to Michael Pucci for producing. And our next program is Friday, March 18th at 1 p.m. on Zoom again, I think. Anne Fernald, who lives in town, is a noted Virginia Woolf scholar and professor at Fordham University. And she's going to speak about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own Today, which is a talk for Women's History Month. And she's super amazing, and it should be a great talk. So I hope people will join. Thank you all again. Thank you, Ron. Yay. Great to see you.
My pleasure. Y'all take care.
You too.
Yep.
Okay.